Well, hello, my name's Peter Cromarty, and in 1983 I was an air traffic controller in Bahrain in the Middle East and was involved in the hijack of an Indian Airlines Airbus A300, and this video is about that event. On the days of the 24th and 25th of August 1984, an Indian Airlines A300 Airbus was hijacked when it was en route from Chandigarh to Srinagar in India on a domestic flight. It was hijacked by the Khalistan Liberation Front, who were Sikh separatists, and they ordered the crew to take the aircraft first of all to Lahore and then on to Karachi in Pakistan, where it was refueled, and stated their intention of going next to Bahrain. During the flight, at some point, they had beaten up the co-pilot, and so the captain, was flying the aircraft solo, along with a flight engineer, because in those days the A300 was a 3-crew aircraft. Bearing in mind that they were on a domestic flight in India, so they had no maps of the region, and so they set off from Karachi towards Bahrain. They changed the call sign to Khalistan and a number, and I can't remember the number, but it was of significance to the Khalistan Liberation Front. Now, before I get into any detail on the hijack itself, I'd like to cover a little bit of geopolitics. Nowadays, aircraft fly from Europe to the Far East, to China, to Singapore, Bangkok, and onwards to Australia by flying directly over Russia and China. So they go in either direction in this sort of route. In 1984, the aircraft didn't have the range to fly those distances, and so they would generally stop somewhere in the Gulf. Furthermore, the Soviet Union's airspace was closed. Because Afghanistan was occupied by the Soviet Union, it was closed as well. Iran had closed its airspace, and Iran and Iraq were in a long-running war that we called Gulf War in those days. So this area of the boundary between Iran and Iraq was also closed, and much of the war took place in marine areas of the Gulf as well. So the most northerly route that aircraft could take to get from anywhere east of the Gulf to anywhere west of the Gulf was through the Gulf. There were no great circle tracks, and there was no GPS. And because of the time zones in the different parts of the world, aircraft would leave Europe and come through the Gulf between about 10 p.m. and 2 a.m. and the westbound traffic would leave the Far East and come through the Gulf between about midnight and 4. So the midnight to 2 a.m. period was very busy generally. It was the busiest part of the day for us. This is an aeronautical chart from 1983, I think. And you can see I've picked out the coastline, so you can see the Straits of Hormuz, the Arabian Gulf, the Gulf of Oman, Iran to the north, Pakistan to the northeast. Bombay was down here to the southeast, and Oman is here, with Saudi Arabia down in the bottom left-hand corner. These are the airspace boundaries. So Bahrain's airspace had a boundary with Tehran, which is this orange line here. To the north of that was Tehran's Flight Information Region, or FIR, their airspace. And to the northeast of this line was Karachi's airspace. As I say, Bombay's FIR was down to the southeast, and this one picks out the Muscat FIR. So the traffic would fly from the Bahrain Western sector and the division between the two sectors, Bahrain East and West, was this approximately green line between Abu Dhabi and Sharjah. In those days, all the airways were defined by ground-based point source nav aids, and the airway that we're interested in ran from Jiwani in the northeast corner, which was a VOR, a VHF omnidirectional radio range, which gives bearing information, and they would fly over Atnis, which was halfway, 171 nautical miles from Jiwani, and then on to Sharjah, which was a VOR and a DME, a distance measuring equipment. So with a VOR radial and a DME distance, you could get a very accurate position of where the aircraft was. The airways then went on to Bahrain, up Alpha 1, Amber 1 as we called it, and towards Doha on Amber 55. You'll have to excuse this yellow highlight here, which I put on at some stage in the past and can't get off now. So the aircraft would come to us from the western sector over Abu Dhabi and Sharjah, and we would hold them from Abu Dhabi until they crossed into the Muscat FIR, and on the Sharjah routes we would hold them until they went down to either Bombay or Karachi, and we would get them back from Muscat down to the southeast here on their way to Colombo or back from Colombo. So this is the eastern sector that I was controlling on the night in question. As you can see, there's no radar, and the control is carried out by using handwritten strips, and there was one strip for each position over which the aircraft would fly. They're arranged geographically on the board. So the northeast corner, Jiwani, was generally up here, and the Colombo tracks are down here. Usually in the bottom left-hand corner would be the Abu Dhabi strips, and Sharjah would be here. But you can see on this night, Jim was pretty busy, and busy enough that he had to split the strips in this bay. So the Abu Dhabi strips, you can see, just make out Abu Dhabi here, and the Sharjah strips here, and it was busy enough that at some point he had to take, he needed the strip for the Sharjah designator, which is presumably this one here. And similarly, there was enough traffic down in the southeast that he has to move the strips for Jiwani over here into this extra bay, and the Jiwani stopper strip is somewhere, probably that one over there. So all of the separations are based on pilot position reports. The blue strips are westbound aircraft, the yellow or buff strips are eastbound aircraft, and an aircraft would make a position report. The controller would strike through the position report and write the actual time of arrival at that position, and then they would write the estimate for the next position on the next strip. When it passed that position, this strip would be discarded and the estimate for the next position would be put onto the next strip. The airways, there was some natural geographical separation for some of the airways, and for others there wasn't, so you had to be careful about which aircraft were at the same level. Okay, so communications were carried out through this panel at the bottom here. So these are all the telephone lines. So they would have direct telephone lines to Abu Dhabi, Sharjah, Ras Al Khaimah, Tehran, Bombay, Karachi, Muscat, and so on. These are the frequency control buttons, and under Jim's left thumb would be the transmit switch for the radio. So on the night in question, the Khalistan aircraft was going to approach from Karachi over Jiwani, was going to fly to Sharjah, and then on to Bahrain. And the aircraft came onto my frequency at Jiwani. So here I've done a diagrammatic version of a strip. There's more information on the strips than is shown here, and obviously being a busy night there were a lot more than two strips, but these were the two significant aircraft on that evening. I don't remember what time the aircraft actually came over Jiwani, but it was around midnight, so I've given the estimated time of arrival for the Khalistan 26 as 0001, and KLF, Khalistan Liberation Front, as I say, I can't remember the number, but there was a significant number for the Khalistanis. So that was 26. The aircraft was an A300, that was the designator in those days because there was only one Airbus. The speed was Mach 0.8, and that was about 460 knots. The other aircraft I had was Bangladesh 001, which was a DC-10 from Dhaka to London, and he was 0.82, 480 knots, about 8 minutes behind 0009, and was also at flight level 280, which is 28,000 feet. Both at the same level. So there was some time between the aircraft departing Karachi and coming into my airspace, so I sat and watched this for a while, and eventually I rang Karachi and said, what are you going to do about these two, because they're not separated? And he said, yeah, but the first one is a hijack. I said, yeah, I know it's a hijack, but I still want them separated. And they were required to give us at least 10 minutes separation between aircraft on the same track, same speed, same level. And bearing in mind that although these were at the same level, there was less than 10 minutes, and the second one was faster. So he said, okay, I'll give you the Khalistan at 310, flight level 310, 31,000 feet. Now, the ops room was full of people. There was people from the company that I worked with, so the general manager, the supervisor, there was the manager external relations, the manager operations, all the way up to the Minister of Communications. There were Bahrain Defence Force pilots who were there to give their expert opinion, and so the first thing, and I had the speaker on so that everybody in the room could hear what was being said on the frequency. So the first thing the Khalistan said to me was that they wanted to land in Bahrain, and there was a certain protocol to be followed under these circumstances. So I asked my supervisor if the aircraft could land in Bahrain. He asked the manager of external relations, and so on up the line to the minister, who said no. So I told the pilot of the Indian Airlines Airbus that the Bahrain authorities would not permit him to land in Bahrain. So he said, okay, the hijackers want to land in Dubai. So I rang Dubai on the direct line and said, the hijacked aircraft wants to come and land with you, and he said no. And so they said Abu Dhabi, and I rang Abu Dhabi, and Ras Al Khaimah, and Sharjah, and Doha, and Dhahran, Kuwait, and everybody said no. So I went back to him and said, look, everybody said no. What are your intentions? And the hijackers said, right, we want to land in Dubai, and please will you give us the Dubai VOR frequency? So again, followed the protocol, because I didn't want to be considered to be in collusion with the hijackers to get them to land in Dubai, because I didn't want the UAE authorities to think that I was, or Bahrain was in collusion to get them to land there rather than Bahrain. And whilst I asked whether I could give him the frequency, another pilot on the frequency gave him the information. Soon thereafter, the pilots on the frequency started reporting that they had lost the navigation aids that they were using. They'd been switched off. And bearing in mind that most of the aircraft needed these point source navigation aids to fly around, find their way around. Not many, some of them had inertial navigation systems. The long haul aircraft had inertial navigation systems, which weren't as accurate as GPS, but they were better than nothing. And but the rest of them all needed the ground-based nav aids. The UAE, it transpired, had switched off all of the nav aids down the western side of my airspace. So they'd switched off Ras Al Khaimah, Sharjah, Dubai, the Abu Dhabi complex of nav aids. they'd switched off the instrument landing systems and the airfield lights. And also, when later on in the evening or the morning, when the Khalistan called Dubai, they wouldn't even talk to him. They talked to other aircraft, but they wouldn't talk to him. They wouldn't answer his calls. So to control my traffic, I had Shinaz, VOR DME, Izki, Muscat, Sur, which were all VOR DME, and Jiwani, which was only a VOR. The Khalistan was flying towards the lights of the city of Dubai, bearing in mind he had been under extreme stress for many hours. The hijack had started early the morning before, and this was early the next morning, and it was still going. He was frequently asking me if he could land, and pleaded with me, told me how many women and children they had on board, prayed to my God that I would get him permission to land, which I was unable to do. And he needed to go down, and I had to get him down through the Bangladesh 001. How did I control my traffic? To be honest, I don't really remember, but I expect I used any nav aids that I had available to me, plus INS position reports, plus dead reckoning position reports, and I managed somehow to get all the traffic to where they wanted to go without any of them bumping into one another. And but the tricky thing now for me was, how was I going to get the Bangladesh, get the Khalistan down through the Bangladesh? So I was expecting to get the DME from Dubai, and so I needed 10 nautical miles DME between them. But I didn't have a DME because Jiwani didn't have a DME and the Dubai was switched off. I needed 10 minutes between them. At the time the levels are crossed. At this moment there must be 10 minutes between them. I didn't have 10 minutes. And the second one was quicker. I said to the Bangladesh, "Can you see this aircraft?" And he said he could see it. Now I don't know whether that was true or not. He was probably 40 or 50 miles behind it. And but it was a clear night, I'm guessing, so he probably thought, well, he's 8 minutes ahead. How bad can it be? And so I said to the pilot of the Khalistan, if you can go down, I suggest you go down now, because the aircraft that is behind you and catching you can see you and says it's fine for you to go down now. Down he went. And he continued on down to about 7,000 feet over the Dubai city and went round in circles over Dubai. And at that point, I'd been on duty on this sector for a couple of hours. And so I said to my supervisor, "Any chance of a break?" And very kindly, he said, "Pete, you're doing a great job. Keep it up. We'll give you a break in a minute." So I stuck with it. Now, as I said, the pilot was very stressed. He kept, every 20 minutes or so, he would say he had 20 minutes of fuel left. And I'm guessing that the Bahrain Defence Force pilots had contacts who flew Airbuses, and they knew how much fuel had been loaded in Karachi. And so they had a rough idea of the endurance of the aircraft. And Dubai kept refusing. However, eventually, after about an hour and a half of going round in circles over Dubai, the pilot of the aircraft said, "We really do only have 20 minutes of fuel left now, and the hijackers have said, if you don't let us land, we will crash the aircraft into Dubai city." So at that point, I told Dubai what had been said, and they said, "Fine, he can land." They switched on their nav aids, they switched on the aerodrome lights, and the Khalistan landed in Dubai. And then strangely, I got my break. So after my break, I went back onto the west radar sector. So this is the radar position for the west sector. This was the approach radar position. This was the procedural board in case the radar failed. There was a supervisor's position, and then there was the eastern sector over here where I had been working previously. And up here we've got information displays backlit, because it was much darker in the room than is shown here, because the radars weren't that bright. They were on cathode ray tube displays. This was the control for the radar head. These are the display these are the display controls, and we've got wind speed and direction, 2 of them, local Gulf weather reports, useful information such as that. So I came back on this position. Now, at that moment, Abu Dhabi complained to us that a Caravel aircraft from India had called them, told them he was going to landed, and it turned out that it was a squad of Indian Special Forces troops, and I presume they didn't call anybody on their way in, so that they didn't tip off the hijackers if they happened to be listening to the Abu Dhabi frequency. Anyway, so we didn't know anything about it, so we couldn't do anything. We couldn't give them an estimate or a release because we didn't know about it. The next thing that happens, as I said to you before, is this was during the return Hajj. There was an Afghan Airlines Boeing 727 from Mecca to Dubai and on to Kabul, and obviously couldn't land in Dubai because Dubai was closed for the hijack in progress, and asked to land at various places around the Gulf, and got the usual "no, we don't take communist aircraft." And I don't know what happened to him. I can't remember what happened to him, but the next one was an Aeroflot Tupolev 154, and same deal, went round the Gulf asking who would let him land. Nobody let him land, and eventually, fortunate for me because I was beginning to reach the end of my tether, the minister tapped me on the shoulder and said, "Look, if you can't find anywhere else for him to land, let him land in Bahrain." So he landed in Bahrain and parked on the cargo apron, and on my next break I nipped out and took a photograph, which is this one here. So what happened to the Indian Airlines Airbus? I don't remember ever hearing what happened to it, because in the Middle East in those days, if the governments didn't want you to know what was going on, it didn't make the papers. However, in my research recently, I've discovered, according to Wikipedia and the mythicalindia.com website, I'll read you what it says. 7 young hijackers on an Indian Airlines jetliner Airbus A300 on a domestic flight from Chandigarh to Srinagar, with 100 passengers on board, demanded to be flown to the United States. The plane travelled to Lahore, then to Karachi, and finally to Dubai, where the Defence Minister of the United Arab Emirates negotiated the release of the passengers. Their aim was to reach the United States and let the West know about the freedom struggle going on in the Punjab. The Press Trust of India quoted the hijackers as saying, "Long live Khalistan." It was related to the secessionist struggle in the Indian state of Punjab, where Khalistani separatists were active. The Sikh hijackers wanted to bring the alleged atrocities against the Sikh community into the limelight. They demanded a separate country for Sikhs. The Khalistan movement is an active separatist movement in Pakistani Punjab and the UK, where a large demographic of Sikh community openly asks for a different country for Sikh people, Khalistan. The UAE negotiated the release of the Indian passengers in lieu of political asylum to the hijackers, but they were later deported to India. All 7 of them were sentenced to life imprisonment and were incarcerated in Ajmer, Rajasthan. So that concludes the story of my involvement with the Indian Airlines Airbus hijack. Thank you very much for watching this video. I hope you found it interesting. And one last little coincidence. This photograph, taken by Les Rickman at Kemble, was when the aircraft was flown into Kemble to be scrapped in 2003. But the coincidence is that when I left the Gulf, I used to work at Kemble when it was a United States Air Force base as an air traffic controller. Anyway, so thank you very much for watching this video, and I hope you enjoyed it.